Welcome to Why Do I Keep Doing That? This podcast is for smart, capable people who are tired of repeating patterns they've already outgrown. I'm Brenda Florida, certified life coach, and if you've ever walked away from a conversation, a decision, or a relationship thinking, why did I just do that again? You are in the right place. You're not stuck, you're patterned. And patterns can be interrupted. In each episode, I'm going to break down why you keep doing what you do, where it started, and how to shift it so you can stop reacting and start leading in your own life. I'm so glad you're here. Who's with me on this one? Why do I keep attracting the same type of partner? This might be a romantic partner, or it could be a work relationship. You keep attracting the same type of boss or hiring the same type of person that doesn't work for you. Okay. So I'm going to tend to talk about this today in terms of romantic relationships, but it applies to any relationship you have that you tend to attract the same type of dynamic in. Okay. So, how about these qualities? I am very familiar with this type of partner, emotionally unavailable. So then I end up over functioning. I chase, I try to fix, I will shrink myself so that I don't upset them so much, or they're intimidated by my ambition, so I'll shrink so that they aren't intimidated by that. I might keep it secretly in my own mind what I want to do. My last partner, when I started my coaching business, and I mean by started, I was still in training. I hadn't actually started the actual business of it. I was in training, and he said to me, well, I mean, we know you're not going to be a rock star, but how much do you really want to work? And I was so offended because, of course, I want to be a rock star. That was my absolute intention of becoming a life coach was to be a rock star at it, because to me that means I'm really good at my craft and, I do really well at it from the business perspective. I don't want to be the best singer in the world who nobody's ever heard sing, because she doesn't have any visibility or anything. So, which is why I do podcasts, right? And post on Instagram and TikTok and whatever to get the message out there, but also for my own visibility. So, anyway, did I let him know how offensive that was to me? No. I froze and smiled while inside I was blowing up, because part of my pattern in particularly romantic relationships, but again, authority figures at work can turn out to be the same thing, is to not rock the boat, to not upset anybody, to not disagree, to not disappoint. So I just grinned and took it like a bullet to the heart. Okay. So if that kind of thing sounds familiar, you may have different dynamics, but you can tell you're repeating them in your marriages, with your lovers, with sexual partners, with whoever it is. Then this is for you, okay? Because it is a pattern. There's nothing wrong with you. It's not bad luck. You're not, fucked when it comes to romance. I have thought that many times. Like, this is just something I'm never going to be able to do in my life. But it's not true. It is a pattern. And part of what I hope you hear in today's episode is that part of what a pattern does is it creates familiarity. We do it over and over again. Think about a pattern like brushing your teeth, okay? Something you do all the time, every day, hopefully maybe multiple times a day, but whatever it is, You do it. You do it without thinking. You don't go in your bathroom and wonder what that, thing is sticking there out of the jar with brushes on the head of it or on the charger, however you brush your teeth. And what should I do with it? No, without even thinking about it, probably at morning and night, you just go in the bathroom, pick it up, put the toothpaste on, and you're brushing your teeth. And if I told you to stop that, there are new studies that indicate that brushing your teeth is very harmful for you. And so you need to stop right now. And even if you believed me and thought, wow, that Brenda Florida, she is brilliant. I'm going to quit brushing my teeth. You would still go in tonight and grab that toothbrush and probably have it in your mouth before you remembered you had made this super wise decision to stop brushing your teeth. Because brushing your teeth is familiar. These things we do all the time over and over again are familiar. And that's what every emotional pattern you have feels like. It feels familiar. Not doing it feels uncomfortable. It can feel inauthentic. I think that's a word. Inauthentic, unauthentic, whatever. Not authentic because it's not how you're used to doing things. So for me to have spoken up in that moment and say, "Oh, wait a minute, actually, I do want to be a rock star." And the way you just said that indicates to me that you don't believe that's possible for me. And I need to, whatever I need at that time. Like maybe I want to hear more about that. Maybe I don't want to hear any more about his opinion. And all I wanted him to know is that I absolutely intend to be a rock star. So he can start adjusting his thinking. But to speak up like that in that, when that was happening, that was about 10 years ago, probably, maybe 11, but anyway, 10 years ago that would have been so uncomfortable for me because even for as far along as I was in my journey, I first got into therapy and started understanding what I'm calling a pattern. That's not the language that my therapist was using, but anyway, doesn't matter. It worked, the language she used. I was in my late 20s. So this was happening with this romantic relationship when I was about 50, 51. So I've been doing my own inner work for a long time. And so I wasn't a baby at it, but in a romantic relationship, breaking out of the pattern was the hardest for me. I was much better at breaking those habits in work. I was better at doing it with friends, but oftentimes our romantic partners are sort of the, hardest place to break these patterns. That and when we have our own children and especially adult children, it can be really hard to break them with your adult children too. But anyway, back to the story. So that pattern popped up. I followed it and I didn't even notice it until about 3 or 4 months later. I was at an event with some other coaching trainees like myself, and something prompted me to relay that story. And not in complaint of my spouse. I was just whatever telling the story. And when it came out of my mouth to another person, and maybe because that person was also, training to become a coach, whatever all the dynamics were, I heard it. I heard it in my own head. I heard how insulted I felt. I heard myself not speak up. I saw myself smiling and just taking that blow to my soul in without even flinching. And so that's where I saw the pattern. So also, I want to create like this realistic expectation, so to speak, for yourself. We will often not realize these patterns are running in real time. And in fact, many people are in coaching relationships with me because of that, because they can tell me a story that was stressful to them or uncomfortable for them or whatever, but they can't see the pattern when I hear it because it's not my life, because I'm not in their subconscious. I can see the pattern. And then we start working on that. Okay, what's the pattern? Where did it come from? It came from a benevolent place. It feels familiar. In romantic relationships or sexual relationships, we can even say it feels like chemistry. Like I had a lot of chemistry with this guy. We had great sex, not that chemistry is only about sex, but there were many ways this was the best relationship I had had in my life. I was married to my high school sweetheart for 16 years, and then we were apart only for like 2 years before I married my second husband. And then he and I were only married 2 years because I realized I repeated the same pattern and married the same kind of person. And I wasn't going to do that again. So I divorced him. And then it was 10 more years before I got in this particular relationship with this particular guy that I'm telling this story about. And so we had a lot of chemistry because your nervous system, my nervous system, is drawn to what it recognizes, not necessarily what's healthy, but what is familiar. And one of the greatest books I've ever read on relationship addictions is Liz Gilbert's new book, Liz Gilbert of the Eat, Pray, Love fame. Her newest book is All the Way to the River. I'm pretty sure that's the correct title. All the Way to the River. Bestseller. She, had lots of interviews with Oprah and Mel Robbins and all the famous, podcast interviewers and all that. And she speaks really beautifully about her own relationship addiction. And I saw in an interview, I think this one was with Oprah, where she said, I'm used to the kind of chaos that one lives in being in a relationship with an addict. And I won't try to repeat her whole story, but her point was when an addict shows up, even though there's all this chaos and all kinds of dynamics that might scare off a lot of people, to her it feels familiar. It feels like home. So she's going to run straight towards it, even though ultimately it will also mean her suffering. And so that is what I did with these three primary, romantic relationships I've had in my life, the two marriages and this last gentleman I was with. It felt familiar. I repeated the pattern. And so I had to really be compassionate with myself, which was hard. I'd done a lot of work on myself. And when I realized how toxic he was for me, how he was repeating these same patterns of emotional and verbal abuse that I was accustomed to from romantic relationships, I thought I had done enough work to not be attracted to that anymore. But obviously, I hadn't. I was attracted to that. And when I looked back on it at that point, I could see all the red flags I ignored, all the red flags I dismissed, which is the way patterns work. Patterns don't want you to change them. That's why this is sometimes, easier said than done. It's not that the concepts I'm talking about are so hard. You understand what I'm saying. It's a pattern. We need to interrupt it. We need to, respond differently. Well, that's simple enough. But these things are as close to you as, the skin on your neck, so to speak. And it feels familiar. It feels awkward to interrupt a pattern. It feels awkward to respond differently. It can feel like it's not the real you. And that is just part of breaking the pattern because the pattern is super familiar, like brushing your teeth. And so we don't want to shame the pattern. We don't want to criticize the pattern. It's not stupid, it's just conditioning. We're not broken. You're not beyond, repair. You don't need fixing, none of that language. You have a pattern that at one time was super beneficial. Growing up with a very critical mom and a super absent father, it was, it made my life easier to dismiss the criticisms and the diminishments that I received. Okay. Because to see your own parent that way when you're a child would be really disorienting and destabilizing. We need our parents, I don't care whether they're fabulous or horrible, abusive. We need our parents for survival. And so as a kid, without think being able to think through this the way I'm about to say it, but as a kid, we just say, "Oh, okay. This isn't safe, but I think doing this will keep me safe. Okay, let's try that." Let's try never getting upset even when she insults me. Let's try never getting upset even when, you know, somebody doesn't believe in me. I never had, I'm not saying this for you to feel sorry for me, but I'll say as a quick tale of myself and my own life, I've never had anybody who really believed in me, who really championed me or thought, I've had plenty of people who like think I'm great. They thought I was when I was singing a lot in high school and in my 20s and early 30s, thought I was a great singer, think I'm really fun and charismatic and, complimentary. I got plenty of compliments, but no one who like championed me or believed in me. I, wanted to, for instance, take voice lessons or take tap dance lessons or, do these things to grow my talent as a performer. And my mom certainly wasn't going to support that because for her, it was all about the money and we didn't have the money. My dad was too absent to be supportive. I never had a teacher, a music teacher or anything like that, that a drama teacher that was like, "Ooh, let me really encourage you to do this." That was not something I experienced. So when my lover partner criticizes my talent or my ability to be successful, that's normal to me. It's familiar. I don't like it, but it's familiar. And so I can just accept it and keep on going. And that's the power of breaking a pattern is you stop accepting and keep on going and you stand up for yourself or you go get the validity, you give yourself the validity that you're hoping somebody outside of you will give you. Because otherwise, what happens is we abandon ourselves. That's primary. I abandoned myself by standing there and smiling at him instead of speaking up and pushing back on his rude and critical comment. I shrank, right? It creates an identity shrinkage there. It will also create, it stacks up and it creates emotional burnout. Lots of time that's lost. Okay. But the part I want you to remember is it's not exactly like you're consciously choosing those outcomes. Your nervous system is, it's your subconscious that is just going to the familiar pattern and responding out of that. So here's what I want you to do this week. When you maybe something will happen, right? A conversation, an event between you and your partner that'll make this come up, or just think about it. Who does that person remind you of? Because that will start to give you some clues. And if I had been thinking about that, I would have remembered, I would have thought about the ways that this guy reminded me of my first and second husband, or reminded me, frankly, of my mother. And I did notice that that was one of the things I noticed and dismissed was that there were a lot of ways that the way he acted towards me reminded me of my mother, and I mean that in ways I didn't like. Okay, my mom wasn't all bad. There were many lovely things my mom did, but he was reminding me of the things that my mom did that were hurtful. And if I could go back and do that over, and what I haven't and won't repeat is dismissing that voice in my head that was saying, wait a minute, this doesn't feel good. This reminds you of your mom. So, who does it remind you of? When did you first feel the dynamic? Like, can you remember being a kid and feeling the same kind of feeling? You might not remember the whole story. You certainly wouldn't have had the adult language to package it in the ways we're talking about it here. But the feeling will be familiar. Oh yeah. I felt so diminished when this happened, but I didn't feel like I could do anything about it. So I just pretended everything was okay. And then what role do I automatically step into? Well, the role I step into is I shut down and then I go internally do what I need to do to try to take care of myself to kind of recover. Like I'll go give myself a little pep talk. No, you can be a rock star. But I don't say anything to the other person because I don't want to make waves or upset them or get in an argument. So the way you respond might be totally different than that. It doesn't matter. It's about that automatic response. We're not going to be able to solve all this on the podcast, but I want you to really start to tune in to these dynamics and how they might be playing out in your life. So you don't need better luck with partners. You need a different response inside your own nervous system. And that's what I'm here for. This is what I do with all my one-on-one clients. It's what happens in the Way Out session. There's going to be a link in the show notes for that, because that is the most powerful way to initiate your work with me. You know, whether you think of it as the first step in a longer journey, or let me try this out and see if it works. Let me see if, she can put her money where her mouth is, so to speak. If I'm the real deal, if I show up just like this with you in a session that I do on the podcast, I do. You won't be surprised at all. But the Way Out session is such a great way to start, because you can experience this, and the benefit of experiencing this cycle of noticing the pattern, interrupting, finding a new way, when it's being facilitated by somebody who's done it herself and done it with hundreds of other people, because it is often not something we can do alone, because these patterns are subconscious. And so that means we don't have a conscious awareness of them until after they've already activated. So there's nothing wrong with you. You don't need fixing. You need a facilitator who is a queen at pattern interruption to help you find the pattern, name the pattern, interrupt it, and begin to choose a different response to change that nervous system so that the pattern starts to be uncomfortable instead of the empowered response. If something in this episode rang true, that matters. Awareness is powerful, but interruption is what creates change. So remember, you're not stuck. There's nothing wrong with you. You're patterned. If you're ready to interrupt that pattern, then book a Way Out session. We'll identify it clearly, interrupt it directly, and build a new response for you. The link is in the show notes. And if this episode helped you see something differently, send it to somebody who needs it. That's how we grow. I also love to give a shout out to listeners who leave reviews and share an episode, because I love recognizing the people who are actually doing the work. I will see you in the next episode.